So we're going to try and do the story of David in 10 minutes or less. We'll see how I go. There's a guy called Jesse. He's got a bunch of sons. David is the youngest. David is up on the hills. He's a shepherd. He sits there and minds the sheep and footles about on his harp, like you would if you were sitting on a hill all day with some sheep. You get quite bored. Occasionally he has to defend the sheep from lions and bears and such with like a little slingshot. He's reasonably good at this. God tells the prophet Samuel that he's going to anoint a new king. They've only had one king so far in Israel, Saul. He didn't really want to be king. He started off okay, but got a bit big-headed about it, so God's like, no, we need a new king. So Samuel comes and asks Jesse where his sons are. And Jesse thinks so that he can anoint the son to be king. And Jesse's like, my oldest son. So he brings the oldest son, and Samuel's like, no. So he brings the second son, and Samuel's like, no. And he keeps doing this. And he's like, I've run out of sons. Oh no. He's like, oh no, wait, I have one more son. He's on the hills with the sheep. His name is David. Samuel's like, fetch that guy. So David comes down, and God says to Samuel, that's the one. So Samuel anoints him with some oil on his head, because that's what you did back then. That was like saying, you are special. You're there. There you go. And then leaves. They don't hear from him again for a while. In the meantime, the Philistines start attacking. They live next door to Israel. They're very bad and large. And David's brothers, who are all older than him, are fighting. So Jesse sends David to take them some food, including some cheese. I don't know why they included this detail, but David takes him some cheese. I imagine like a large roll that he has to kind of push. So he takes his brother some cheese. And when he gets there, they're all really scared because the enemy have got this guy called Goliath, who's pretty large, and no one really wants to fight him, and they've issued like a challenge. And David looks at him and thinks about all the bears and lions that he's fought, and is like, I can kill that guy. So all the soldiers say, well, if you think you can kill him, you should speak to King Saul. So David goes and speaks to King Saul and says, King Saul, I can kill that guy. God is on my side. I'm pretty sure I can do it. And Saul's like, if you want to try, you should take my armour. So he gives David all his armour, but David's like little, he's like a teenager. So the armour just swamps him. He's like, I can't even see. I don't need all this stuff. So he takes it all off again and goes and gets 5 smooth round stones from the riverbed and puts them in his pocket. He's got his slingshot and he walks out onto the battlefield, and as we all know, ends up killing Goliath, cuts his head off, and the army loves him. They're just like, yes, David! And Saul is quite impressed. And David ends up hanging around at the palace a lot. He makes really good friends with Saul's son Jonathan. They get on really, really well. They're like absolute besties. They do everything together. There's even some people that think they like each other maybe a little more than just friends. But this is quite a rare reading, and most people are just like, no, they're just like really close buddies. Like, we just don't see that kind of stuff anymore. Saul, he gets a bit grumpy. And because David plays the harp, because of all that time practicing on the hills, Saul gets him to play the harp. However, there's a problem. Because David was so successful in killing Goliath, people are calling him a hero, and Saul's beginning to fear a bit for his future, that he might get overthrown. David might take his place and become king. And so one day when David's playing the harp, Saul's thinking about this and gets so mad, he just grabs a spear and throws it at David. And David dodges and runs out of the room, and he goes to Jonathan. He's like, Jonathan, your dad just tried to kill me. And Jonathan's like, what? I'll go speak to him. So he goes and speaks to him. He's like, Dad, you tried to kill David. And Saul explains what's going on. And that he feels that David's going to try and overthrow him. So he's going to try and kill him. And Jonathan's like, oh, well, this isn't good. So he goes and tells David, David's hiding out in the field, just to be on the safe side. He's hiding in case Saul wants to kill him. And Jonathan leaves a pre-agreed sign there that basically tells David that he's got to run, that he can't stay, Saul wants to kill him. So he comes out and they say goodbye, and they're just like, dude, I'm going to miss you so much, man. And then David goes. And basically he spends his time kind of wandering around the country. He's a bit of a... Robin Hood's not quite the right word. He's like Éomer in Lord of the Rings. He's still loyal to the crown and still loyal to Saul, and is defending the borders from enemies and stuff like that. But Saul's also trying to kill him. So David's like here, fighting some guys, and Saul's like, oh, he's there. So he goes to try and kill him. But David finds out he's coming, and he moves along. And they have lots of adventures with different people that David meets. He ends up getting his first wife, Abigail. Basically because Abigail's wife was a bit of a douche when they turned up, and God was not happy with this, and Abigail's husband ended up dying, and Abigail apparently preferred David anyway. He was young and quite good looking, so we hear. So yeah, Abigail marries David, and she joins the caravan, and they keep going, and Saul's chasing them, and they're chasing them all across the country. And on 2 occasions, David has the chance to kill Saul, but refuses to do so, even though Saul's trying to kill him. And he deliberately cuts, on, one of the time, a bit off Saul's robe. And Saul wakes up, and David's like, look, I've got a bit of your coat here that I've just cut off. I could have killed you, but I'm not going to. God appointed you as king, and maybe he appointed me as king too, but while you're still alive, I'm not going to mess with you being God's king, so stop chasing me. And this kind of really gets to Saul. He's like, no, you're right, you could have killed me and you didn't. So obviously you don't have designs on my throne while I'm alive. I should calm down. He doesn't calm down. But anyway, eventually Saul and Jonathan are killed in a big battle, and David is extremely sad and writes a song about it on his harp. Just about how great they were, how much he admired them, and how close he and Jonathan were, and it's like really sad. But then he comes back, and the prophet, I think Samuel might be dead by this point, it might be Nathan who's the new prophet, and he basically announces that David is God's next chosen king, which is awesome. David gets another wife, Saul's daughter, who helped him escape from the palace on one occasion. Her name is something like Michal. And there's this one occasion, Michal and David don't see eye to eye on things. David's just like, yeah, I'm totally up for like making, even if it means looking bad, just doing what God wants you to do and just telling God how much I love him. So they managed to get, I think it's the Ark of the Covenant, they steal it back from some guys who stole it off of them, and David's so happy that he leads the procession down the street with the ark coming back into town, and he's like dancing around, and he's just not even put any clothes on. He's just like, yeah, I'm gonna dance in the nude because I'm in front of God, and yay. And Michal's not too happy with this. I can't really say I blame her. If my husband suddenly just ripped all his clothes off and started dancing down the street, I'd be a little surprised as well. But this was it. David just felt that when it came to worshipping God, he just had to do what he had to do. So he just did it. And she wasn't too happy about that. So she is the second wife that David has. And the third wife, as we know about, is Bathsheba. And David's up on his roof one day taking a stroll, and he happens to see across into the neighbouring building and sees Bathsheba having a bath. It's a bit like the episode of Friends when they've got that guy in the opposite building that is the nudist, and they keep seeing him doing stuff in the nude. Yeah, it's like that. They can just see in through her window, and he's like, "Wow, that lady, she's super hot." And his advisors are like, "I'm sorry, she's married." And David's like, "Oh, she's married. What am I going to do?" So he basically arranges to have her husband, who is a soldier, put on the front line in battle so that he gets killed, so that he can have Bathsheba for his wife. God is not cool with this at all, and he sends prophet Nathan to kind of have a stern talk with David. He tells him this story about like this poor guy who has a lamb, and then this rich guy comes along who has like loads of lambs, but he still steals the lamb from the poor guy anyway, just because he wants one more lamb. And Nathan is like, "David, who is the douche in this story?" And David is like, "Well, the rich guy is the douche because he stole the lamb off the poor guy." And Nathan's like, "That's you. You are the douche." And David's like, "I'm the douche. Ah, man. No." And he does marry Bathsheba. And I think their first child does die, which is kind of as a consequence of his sin. Like, God's just like, well, no. Which you can have a long conversation about involving morals. But anyway, the first child dies, but they have another son who is Solomon. And as we know, King Solomon grows up to be extremely wise and builds the temple in Jerusalem. David wanted to build the temple, and he said to God on one occasion, like, "Can I build this temple? I really want to, just a place where you can be honoured and where you can be, like, physically represented in the city," because as we discover through the Bible, much as God's like, "Don't be making idols and don't be doing this," we do find it difficult, humans find it difficult to like focus on something invisible that we can't see. So occasionally, God does indulge us with these things. And so he's like, "Yeah, a temple is fine. I'm happy with that. But you're not the one to build it. You've got, there's too much blood on your hands, essentially. I can't let you do it. But I will let your son do it." And David's like, Okay, that's fair deal. All right, I understand. And so he starts saving up for when this happens. Solomon is not the oldest child. David has a bunch of other kids. They're a mixed bunch. David as a parent is not great. If I can get this the right way around, one of his sons basically really fancies his half-sister, Tamar, and pretends to be ill, so she comes to his room and traps her there and rapes her, which is obviously just awful. And David's like, well, I want to punish him, but he's my son and I can't. But one of Tamar's brothers, Absalom, is obviously infuriated by the treatment of his sister, and he goes and catches the guy who killed her and kills him. And then he gets killed in town on his way back because he's killed a prince. So now David's like, well, one of my sons is dead, and then one of his sons is against him, and then he's dead, and it's just all awful and crappy and horrible. Something good that happens is Jonathan, Saul's son, who was like David's best friend. He had some family of his own. He had like a wife and some kids, and I can't remember if it was like a nephew or I want to say it was a nephew. But anyway, a blood relation of his turns up at court. He's young. He's like a teenager, and he's crippled, if I remember correctly. And he kind of explains who he is, and he's like, I know that Jonathan was the son of Saul, and Saul tried to kill you, and you know, I'm sorry about that, and here I am, you know, do with me as you will. And David basically gets off his throne, comes down the steps, and embraces him. And like, well, just for the sake of, you know, my brother Jonathan, I will look after you. You'll have a place here, living with me for as long as you want, which is really cool. I'm trying to remember how David dies. I have a feeling he just dies of old age. I'm going to check that on Google. But yeah, he is credited with writing most of the Psalms. Whether he did or not is kind of up for grabs. We think he certainly did write some of them. Here we go. I'm on Google. Blah, 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 blah. Death of David. Oh, there we go. When David has become old and bedridden, Adonijah, his eldest surviving son and natural heir, declares himself king and worthy to marry someone called Abishag. But Bathsheba, who's Solomon's mum, remember, and Nathan the prophet, they go to David and get him to announce Solomon the next heir. There we go. That's what happened. Yep. And David dies and is buried in the city of David, having ruled for 40 years over Israel. Yeah. So there we go. He lived for 40 years. As he was king for 40 years. I think that's all of the major points, actually. And as we know, Solomon, his son, is the one that does go on to build the temple. And God appears to him in a dream and asks him what he would, you know, what would you want? If you could ask one thing from me, what would it be? And Solomon thinks about it, and it's like, it doesn't say money, it doesn't say power. He says, I want to be wise. And God says, that's a good answer. It's such a good answer. I'm also going to give you all the things that you didn't say. And so Solomon is very powerful, and he is very wise, and he is very rich, and he's respected by a lot of people. However, he goes off the rails slightly later on in his life, because he marries lots and lots of women from all different nations, and they kind of water down his belief in God a bit, and they begin this kind of series that we see of like, you get some good kings and some bad kings and some good kings and some bad kings, they go on all through the book of Kings 1 and 2. Oddly enough, it's a book about kings and it's called Kings. And then eventually you get Israel splitting into the north bit and the south bit, and then it gets very confusing because one of them is still called Israel and one of them is still called Judah, and then occasionally they call them both Israel just for convenience, if they're talking about them both together. And that state of affairs carries on for a very long time, and you've got the prophets, and then they all get exiled into Babylon. Yep. That's what happened. And then some of them start coming back 70 years afterwards. and they rebuild Jerusalem, and they're there for a couple of hundred years, and then Jesus is born, and that's when the New Testament starts, and Jesus, as we know, is a descendant of David. Yay! And that's the history of David. It took me 15 minutes, which is half as long again as I thought it would. Okay.